the crisis that we're studying is getting worse and worse and worse. And I hope that even if it risks depressing you, that you take some time now in this semester to pay a bit more attention to financial news than you might have done anyway. Because it'll help clarify what we're doing in the class. It'll suggest questions to you. It'll pique your interest perhaps in ways that it didn't before. But truly remarkable things are happening. This last week, just to give you an example, the World Bank issued a report, a very important report, in which it begins to sound the alarm about the effects in the third world, the whole world, but particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, of the downturn as it spreads from the United States globally, and the weakness of many of these economies puts them in a very vulnerable position to handle the effects. Another piece of information coming out is that the a number of the Eastern European countries are in extreme difficulty. They basically borrowed huge sums of money, usually in two currencies, the euro and the Swiss franc. And as their economies get into trouble and their currency suffers, they are stuck with having to pay loans that keep costing them more and more because it takes more and more of their currency to buy a Swiss franc or to buy a euro. And so as their economies get into worse shape, their debts become larger. It's the worst of all possible worlds. And there's serious question whether there will not now be shortly a default of a country or several. And not only in Eastern Europe, but that's particularly acute there right now. And that, lastly, that one of the phenomena driving all of this, and you should appreciate the ironies of a system when it begins to break down, this is the kind of contradictory absurdity that comes to the fore. It's partly a sign that the situation is serious, is that I was about to say the Bush administration, the Obama administration, in trying to borrow the money, we talked about that last time, to pay for the stimulus, is drawing loanable funds from all over the world here. So that if the effort made by the Czech government or the Polish government or any one of dozens of other governments needing to borrow to get through a hard time cannot, that all the money that they might have otherwise accessed, that they weren't able to access before, isn't available. Because any lender comparing, let's see, I could lend my money to the Polish government or to the American government, that is a no-brainer. The Polish government's much too vulnerable, much too shaky in comparison. The Polish government can fall and you're okay. If the American government falls, it's over anyway, and money is no longer your problem. Your problem isn't money, your problem is running very quickly and figuring out in what direction. Yes?
Where does the IMF and World Bank stand in this thing? Where do they get their money from? And, I mean, these are the institutions that are supposed to give these countries
help.
Loans if a situation like this comes.
They're in the same situation as we're going to go through now with banks and insurance companies, which is they were designed and they were given money. Basically, they get contributions from member governments. That's how they get the money, most of it. They were designed to handle small problems, temporary problems, particularly the IMF. Remember, the IMF is supposed to handle a short-term difficulty that a government gets into. The World Bank is a different thing. It's supposed to help in long-term economic development projects. So keep a sense, at least they're supposed to be. They sometimes stray into each other's area, but that's the idea. To answer your question simply, they don't have enough money. They can't handle a problem that is much larger than anyone foresaw. So in order for the IMF to make a kind of difference now, it would need a vast new influx of money from the member governments. They'd all have to kick in huge amounts of money just at the time when they don't have that kind of money to do that. They're busy trying to save themselves, and so they're not in a position to get, they may have to. It becomes also political in Eastern Europe. Come on in. It becomes political in Eastern Europe, for example. A number of the Eastern European governments would like to borrow money from the one country in Europe that's in a position to lend it to them so far, which is the German government, which is by far the strongest economy. It was already before the disasters of this current crisis, but they're becoming even more relatively strong because the Germans are not as in bad trouble as most of the other countries of Europe. Germans were traumatized the last time these sorts of things happened. The Germans, remember, I think I told you, but if not again, right? Germany loses World War I. It's the end of the Kaiser, of the old empire of the Germans. Suddenly, this whole empire collapses, and they are taken over internally by the collapse and loss of World War I. They get rid of the Kaiser, and the socialists take over. The 1920s is a socialist period of government in Germany, very moderate socialist, but it was socialist. And the disaster of World War I was barely over, with a German population having to try to understand that there was no more Kaiser, that the government was now in the hands of people who were socialists, who not only didn't like the Kaiser and didn't like the empire and didn't like the old landed feudal aristocrats of the eastern part of agrarian part of Germany, but they didn't much like capitalism either. They were in favor of workers. That's a lot to ask a population to go through. Losing a world war, which you had gloriously entered sure you were going to win, and then to be governed by socialists with a whole new agenda that they were all excited about. A small matter. These socialists also included a disproportionate number of German Jews. Since you all know what happens in Germany later, this is not an unimportant fact. The Jews made it up into the top parts of German society, in part by their role in the trade unions, in intellectual circles, and in the Socialist Party, which was a very large party. Very different, say, from Russia in 1917, where the Socialist Party that takes over is a very small party, where the mass of people have nothing to do with socialism. That's not the case in Germany. When the German socialists take over, they are the second biggest party in Germany. So that's a mass organization that has deep roots in Germany, been going for many, many decades and building up its strength. So it takes over. It's a very different sort of phenomena, but nonetheless it's difficult for the Germans. Then in the 1920s, a bare 3-4 years after the war is over, 5 years after the war is over, the German economy suffers another shock. They have one of the greatest inflations in the history of the world. In a period of 7 months, the currency, the value of the German mark, as it's called, the Deutschmark at that time, goes from, I think, 8 to the dollar to 4 trillion to the dollar. That's an inflation. Prices, my mother was a young woman in Germany. My mother was born in Germany, and she was a young woman. And she remembers her father being paid twice a day at his job, being paid a bag, what we would nowadays call, think of a brown grocery bag that you get at a grocery store, full of money. And he would run home and give it to her mother, my grandmother, the bag of money, and she would run. I mean it, not walk, run, because my mother, a little girl, kind of watched this bizarre behavior, and she would run to the store to buy things with the bundle of money, because if she waited till that evening, it wouldn't be worth anything anymore. So she could get a bag of groceries with the half day's pay at lunch. By dinner, she couldn't get, she could get 2 potato chips out of the bag for that amount of money. And the prices were rising many times per day. They would be doubling and tripling across each hour. Okay. What this did in Germany was couple the trauma of the end of the Kaiser, of the loss of a world war, of the opprobrium of the world as having caused the war. For those of you who don't know, World War I was the most violent, destructive war that Europe had ever seen. In many ways, it is still now the most violent war that we have record of in terms of destruction of people, of animals, of countryside. What this inflation did was wipe out 3 generations of savings. Germans are very frugal people. They save money. They don't invest it. They don't buy stocks or bonds. They put it in a mattress. It was at that time very difficult even to get them to put it in banks because they didn't trust the banks, which turned out to be very smart on their part. And so the bourgeois family, the middle-class German burgher family, had money saved. That money became worthless. 3 generations of savings accumulated that had been very valuable ended up being worth, over a period of a month, enough to buy a quarter pound of butter. So now they lost their empire, lost the war, were governed by socialists, and had been wiped out financially. They had nothing. They had nothing at a time when jobs were very shaky. 5 years later, the inflation rises and falls very quickly, 1922, 1923. In 1929, 6 years later, the Great Depression hits, and they lose their jobs. They have no more savings. The country is a wreck. It is a psychological wreck. Everything that it had, it lost. Everything that little middle class had accumulated had been taken from it. It was ripe and ready to find somebody to be very, very angry at for all that had happened to them. Socialists, communists, Jews, good group. All you needed was somebody to mobilize mass upset in that direction. Arrives, very interesting, a great celebrator of tall, blonde, blue-eyed Germans. Who was he? A small, short, dark-haired Austrian. But that's what Hitler was. But the power of the problem meant, who cares? It's a little bit like when Reagan became president of the United States and began his song and dance about family values. This man had been divorced twice, had a history of bed hopping that rivaled that of any other actor around. The only difference was he wasn't a good actor. He may have been good in that other activity, I don't know, but yet it didn't make any difference. People wanted to believe in all of this stuff, so that was fine. You forgot about that. So the issue is, you can traumatize a population by the kinds of difficulties that this sort of economic downturn produces. And people are beginning to get very, very scared around the world by the cascading level of problems and the difficulties that lie in the way of any kind of solution. And I don't mean to mess up your week by giving you a bad story, but as I told you at the beginning, I'm just the reporter here. I'm not the cause of this stuff. But it will help you understand these things, to pay a bit more attention to the financial press. If you get a chance to look at the Wall Street Journal, I think I may have mentioned to you, if not, there is a really very good weekly update that I think is one of the best. It's in something called Barron's magazine, comes out at the end of each week. There's a lead article, and the guy is a very good writer with a very good sense of humor. His name is Alan Adelson. Is it Abelson or A? B or D? B. Alan Abelson. You'll see it right at the beginning. It's like 4 or 5 pages into the beginning of each Barron's. You'll have his thing. He has some name for it, Talk of the Week, or.
But it's also free on their website, which is not everything.
Even better, so you don't have to pay for it. Go to their website. But he gives a kind of a weekly roundup of what's been going on in finance, in the markets, and it's very serious and very accurate, but always tongue-in-cheek. Lots of humor. You will enjoy it, and it's a very well done piece of work. He's been doing that for many, many years. He knows everything and everybody. He's a very good person to learn to read. Everyone agrees we have to lower the rates, but there's a problem. They're already so low, there's not much more lowering you can do. And the anxiety about the symbolism of doing what the Japanese let the interest rates go into negative territory. And there's nothing to prevent that. That's the next step. But that has psychological consequences. What are people going to understand when the bank says, we'll lend you $100 on condition that a year from now you give us 98? That's the deal. That's what a negative interest rate is. That's when the government is pushing the banks to lend money and making it so attractive that they pay you to borrow. Now, you've never had that in the United States, so you're all giggling. But we're really close right now. We're just barely less than a point above that. And
what happened in Japan? They lost their.
They did it. The banks Basically, what the government does is it subsidizes the bank. The government lends the money at a negative interest rate to the bank, so the bank can then afford to do the same thing to the public.
But what happened to the
Well,
banks?
the important thing, by the way, for you all to understand here is that we are now in a government-operated economic system. The private capitalist system that you were all taught as you grew up to celebrate is dead. It's lying there, bleeding. It can't function. Everything that happens now depends on one or another boost given by the government, which is counting on all of you, those of you that are American citizens here, to support this, support it politically with your votes, economically with your taxes, and ideologically by not asking all the difficult questions about this. Like, why are we doing that? Why do we have private enterprises? If this is how they work, all those questions which are coming, and they're coming soon, and they will come to the fore in the United States. They will. But not yet, and that's understandable because the shock hasn't kind of worn off yet so that people can begin to think that there's still basically a level of panic. But I don't think there's anything that you can't read about now that won't connect to what we're doing. Everyone agrees we have to lower the rates, but there's a problem. They're already so low, there's not much more lowering you can do. And the anxiety about the symbolism of doing what the Japanese let the interest rates go into negative territory. And there's nothing to prevent that. That's the next step. But that has psychological consequences. What are people going to understand when the bank says, we'll lend you $100 on condition that a year from now you give us 98. That's the deal. That's what a negative interest rate is. That's when the government is pushing the banks to lend money and making it so attractive that they pay you to borrow. Now, you've never had that in the United States, so you're all giggling. But we're really close right now. We're just barely less than a point above that. And
what happened in Japan? They lost their...
They did it. The banks... Basically, what the government does is it subsidizes the bank. The government lends the money at a negative interest rate to the bank, so the bank can then afford to do the same thing to the public.
But what happened to the
Well,
banks?
the important thing, by the way, for you all to understand here is that we are now in a government-operated economic system. The private capitalist system that you were all taught as you grew up to celebrate is dead. It's lying there, bleeding. It can't function. Everything that happens now depends on one or another boost given by the government, which is counting on all of you, those of you that are American citizens here, to support this, support it politically with your votes, economically with your taxes, and ideologically by not asking all the difficult questions about this. Like, why are we doing that? Why do we have private enterprises? If this is how they work, all those questions which are coming, and they're coming soon, and they will come to the fore in the United States. They will. But not yet, and that's understandable because the shock hasn't kind of worn off yet so that people can begin to think that there's still basically a level of panic. But I don't think there's anything that you can't read about now that won't connect to what we're doing. Shoot.
Just interested, what happens, because there's this whole talk that they're going to let Citigroup go down, but then now recently the Obama administration saying we'll never let the Citigroup go. But what would happen if an institution like that did go down? What does that mean? And what happens to all the loans? And all
At this point, it wouldn't mean very much because it is already a government institution, in fact. I mean, the last time I looked, the share price of Citi was below $1. I think it was 90-something.
Like a bottle of water.
Like a bottle of water, right? A share of...
Water's more.
Water is more expensive.
What would happen, for example, if I do owe Citigroup or Citibank a ton of money because I'm at the new school, right? So that, say, $45,000 that I owe
You're not going to get out of that, no matter what happens.
All right, that's the dream. Right?
Yes.
So with that, I owe the state?
Yeah,
I owe
absolutely. You already owe the state. Citibank is now a shell. It may be reconstituted as a private company. That's actually what they're struggling over now. What's going to happen, probably, and I don't know, nobody knows for sure, or let's put it this way, those who tell you what's going to happen don't know, and those who know aren't going to be telling you. So those are the two. Keep always that in your mind. That's the way this works. It's the way it works. But basically, the government and Citibank are now arguing how to reconfigure Citi. What things will be left with something that's a private bank, which may keep the name or not and continue, and what other parts are the government going to take over and operate because it's impossible to keep the existing mess as one unit. But what will happen is those that are considered good debts like yours, where there's a presumption this person will pay, has the capacity or likelihood of paying, that will be, given the way our country works, that will be given back to a private bank to be able to collect. What the government will be left with is all the questionable stuff. Some of you have been reading a little bit. You've heard about the concept of a bad bank. If you read it, that's what a bad bank is, a bank set up by the government into which are put all of the questionable, dubious, uncollectible, unpayable loans. And those are left to be the government's problem, leaving the private one with a bank that can function as a private enterprise. That's what you do when you have a society committed to private enterprise. It does what I just described. That's what it believes in. And that it doesn't do because it's economically smart. That's a political, ethical value issue. And that is held to by people who don't really much care about the economic efficiency of something. They'll make arguments about, in the long run, it's the most efficient. But those are rational, ex post kinds of reasoning. That's not being done out of an economic efficiency calculus. So my guess is you will see a whole host of things happen in which all of the top 8 or 9 banking groups in the United States, Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, a few of them, will emerge in various new forms, some with old names, some with new names, but reconfigured, reorganized into a private and a state thing. Unless things get so bad that they can't even, there's nothing rescuable, then the government will take them over. Remember that in other capitalist societies, banks have been taken over by governments, and that has operated perfectly well for decades. For most of the period since World War II, the bulk of the banks in France were government owned and operated. Did any of you think over the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s, when you may have taken a trip to Paris and you walked through the streets of Paris, you noticed you're in a capitalist society? It probably never dawned on you that you weren't. And you're right, you were. But it happened to be one that had nationalized the banks, most of them. And that's the way that was done in France. It's just a nationalized... And France is not the only country. So the idea that capitalism cannot work if you have... That's not a problem. Not a problem. Just like when the United States took over the post office, the United States took over Amtrak. Amtrak was once a private railroad system. It isn't. It's a government railroad system, etc., etc. And you get on an Amtrak train, you don't feel any different than if it weren't. You probably never even thought about it. Exactly. You never even thought about it. In school, you were told to think this is a very important question. Is it run by the private sector or is it run by the government? In practice, no one gives it there. This is not a question that's urgent in your own life, unless you're given lots of training to think it might be and ought to be, which some of you have gotten that training, and I feel sadly for you, but I understand that, and that's okay. It's important to you, and far be it from me to disrupt your psychology here, but no, the government is faced with the alternative, which is, and that's really in a sense your question, what happens if you actually did, by the way, what the private enterprise economics that I was taught, that I'm supposed to be teaching, but of course I had much more fun by making fun of it. I'm supposed to be teaching says that, it's a private enterprise, and if it can't go anymore, if it's made mistakes, if it's made bad investment, if it can't, that's what a private, bye-bye, into the toilet you go. And then we're supposed to believe, remember what we did the first couple days of this class, then we're supposed to believe that this is that weeding out process, that kind of, remember the metaphor I gave you of those nature movies where the herd of antelope are running across and the nasty panther catches one because that one is slow or sick, and so you're supposed to feel good as you watch the poor animal being eaten alive, that this is good for the herd as a whole, because you don't want those bad genes in that weak one to be continued in the blah blah. So we should all sit there and say, bye bye Citibank, bad gene, you're out. I can't do that. Why not? Because too many people have dependence on that company. Just to give you an example, Citibank used its enormous wealth and prestige to borrow huge amounts of money, issuing bonds. So you could lend to the Citibank. You had a AAA rating. It was a secure loan. So now you are I'll pick something for you that you would enjoy. You are the hospital for sick children in Boise, Idaho. And your endowment that keeps your hospital going is there invested in Citibank bonds that you've been holding for 30 years. So now you got a choice. If you let Citibank go bye-bye, and then the bonds are worthless because you got a bankrupt company that doesn't have to pay on its bonds because that's what bankruptcy means, then the Boise Hospital for Crippled Children closes. And all the little cripples are thrown out in the snow, right? It's very interesting. What do? Right? We don't, as a nation, we have a problem. We do not want to see front page of the Daily News, little crippled children in the snow. We don't want it. We don't know how to cope with that. That's a problem. So we won't let that happen. The political leadership, who are going to have to stand there and take the heat for this, they don't want that. So you can't. Maybe more honestly, it's not so much about the crippled children in Boise, it's about 50 other large corporations, including many other banks, that also hold these things. And if you let them go, they're going to have to declare bankruptcy, and then countless depositors are not going to get their money, or the government's going to have to make all that up, and the government hadn't planned on spending all that. Boom, boom, boom. So at this point, the government is in a salvage operation. It's actually saying to itself, which is greater? Letting them go, like Citibank, and then dealing with all of the cascading problems that will flow from that, or saving Citibank. And so far, they're deciding to save Citibank. Leading, of course, critics to say, maybe you didn't do that because it's the lesser evil. Maybe you're hooked up with Citibank, want to save them at the price of everybody else, and so forth. The herky-jerkiness of the government was shown because it wasn't that long ago that we had a very big bank called Lehman Brothers, which was allowed to die. They were refused what is now, in retrospect, a small amount of money, $6 billion roughly, would have kept them going. And they were told, it's the way it is. You're a 120-year-old bank, been here a long time, you're very well connected. Too bad. Bye-bye, you die. That led to such problems because it turned out all kinds of institutions around the world held the debt of Lehman Brothers, did business with Lehman Brothers, expected Lehman Brothers to play all kinds of roles in deals that had been made and that were ongoing. All of that came to a crashing halt. And the fallout from that was considered to be so bad that it traumatized the Paulson and the Treasury, and that has carried over because it was Paulson's deputy who was, after all, the Treasury Secretary now, the one who headed the Federal Reserve Bank here in New York, Geithner. So they were all so badly shocked by this event that they don't want to let anything go now, but for fear. Best example we're going to do a little bit later today is better than Citibank is the AIG insurance company. But I'm going to deal with that as an important example. But these are all now government entities. The AIG is not a private company, whatever. It's just not. And nor is Citibank, nor is Bank of America. None of them. I mean, they keep hobbling along, but the government owns them for all practical purposes. They can't do anything unless the government tells them. They can't do anything that the government tells them not to do. So are they technically independent still? Yes. Do they make the decisions? No. So nationalization, it's America. So nationalization is a reality, but we pretend by not saying we haven't done it, it isn't there. Okay? That's like saying you're winning the war in Iraq. No, it's verbalization. What?
Or Vietnam.
That we won in Vietnam, or that we're really doing well in Afghanistan. These are pretend things. You can't. It's sad. It's sad because it really doesn't help in the long run to pretend like this. It doesn't solve the problem. Doesn't get you out of the situation. Doesn't do these things. Usually keeps you in longer than you should, and you see that later retrospectively. But the trick is to figure it out first, before things hit the fan, which is now my favorite phrase. Let's pick up where we left off. I want to make sure we were all on the same page, since it was 2 weeks ago, that we're dealing with the watershed of the 1970s, first from the point of view of the mass of working people, and then from the point of view of the employer. First the employee, then the employer. To remind you what we did with the employees first, we went through this remarkable history of American consumerism and consumption, the fact that real wages in America rose from 1820 to 1970, and then stopped for the reasons that we went through, that the American working class was traumatized by this event, all the more so because it wasn't conscious. It wasn't dealt with as a conscious, explicit problem that we needed to talk about and discuss what options we as a working people had to cope with it. None of that happened. It was kind of left to each individual to discover it for himself or herself and to navigate in his or her personal life and family how to cope. And we now know retrospectively that the two major coping mechanisms were doing more work, more hours of labor, having more members of the household go out and do more hours of paid labor, on the one hand, and borrowing money up the wazoo on the other hand. And producing 25 years later, say moving from 1975 to the millennium year 2000, producing a population that had become physically exhausted by all the work, had become emotionally stressed by the disintegration of the family, since the big change in labor was the labor of the women, who went out of the household and did paid labor and proved themselves incapable of handling both a full-time job outside and holding together the family as they had been doing before. That meant family life disintegrated and became more difficult for everybody in a variety of ways, putting enormous stress on people. And finally, the burden of debt rising so quickly meant enormous anxiety, understandably, that anything that might happen to interfere with your income would bring a crash of your indebtedness that you could no longer sustain down around your head. So you were worried about your debts, you were facing a dissolving home life, and your wages weren't going up anymore. And it brought the working class of America, by the beginning of this century, to a state of physical exhaustion and psychological stress. That meant that no more work could be done, that personal life was in serious disarray and beginning to interfere with work, and that the debt was meaning that a larger and larger portion of your income could not be used to buy objects because you were using more and more of it simply to pay back your accumulated debt. Okay. I want to turn then to the employer class and focus mostly on how this whole experience looks from that side. And to do that, I want to remind you again of this simple graph, the 1820, 1970, 2009. This is the productivity, the amount of goods and services per hour of American workers' labor. And underneath it, the story of wages, which looks like that. In other words, around the 1970s, the rise in wages per hour of work levels off, trails slightly down, but basically flattens out, so that the distance between gets larger and larger. And that distance between is the difference between the amount of stuff produced by a worker in an hour, kept rising, but the amount of payment you gave to that worker, who became ever more productive, stayed the same. Therefore, the difference between what the worker produced for the employer to sell and what the employer had to give the worker to come there and do it got wider and wider. That difference here we're going to call, because it's the basis of it, profit. So the most important thing for you to see is that the last 30 years have been a profit bonanza for employers. They have been able to arrest the long-term growth of real wages. And by the way, this is, again, not an act of nastiness on the part of employers. It is not something undertaken to deviously abuse people. It is a response of the employers to the conditions of the labor market that we went through before. Remember, we talked about women going to the labor force. We talked about computerization that reduced the demand for labor. We talked about export of jobs, and so on. What's your question?
Yeah, I remember last time you talked about that, the labor force went in and then computer processing.
Right.
But it would seem that even though it happened, it seemed that there would be the opposite reaction in a sense, because since there was more productivity, you would think that wages would increase or that people would demand that anyway. So I just had an argument with somebody about that last week when we were discussing.
But yes, if I can rephrase your question, and if I do violence to it, correct me. If you're saying that the rising productivity would have, in a sense, made it possible for the employer to give some of that gain in output back to the worker in the form of a rising wage, absolutely. That's what had been going on for the previous 150 years. So, yes, it could have happened. And you're also right that workers, had they been ever presented with the question, would you like that to happen? My guess is most workers, like me, would have said, absolutely, I wish this to continue. I would rather have rising wages as the reward for my harder and harder work, just as my parents and grandparents and the generations before me wanted and got that. I would like to keep that all going. So yeah, I don't think this is a question of workers not wanting it, and I don't think it's a question of employers not being able, if you like, to use that word, to do it. They were able, precisely because the productivity lines kept rising. Here, by the way, they're all rising at the same rate. That's not historically accurate. They go at different rates. But to make the story simple, I'm keeping the lines roughly the same. The gap here widening, that is the case. Right? So that we know that employers, they weren't mean-spirited, but they took advantage of the labor market. They didn't have to raise wages. They had lots of people available competing for the jobs, and so they found all the usual reasons people can find to not do something that somewhere in the back of their mind they might have thought they ought to have done. But, if you don't have to pay your workers more, you don't.
So like increased labor force, more people available, not that sense of like competitiveness as far as wages.
That's right. You had an excess of people. You had lots of people. If this one didn't work out, there were lots. You knew that if you put an ad in the local paper, there'd be 10 people that would probably, half of them have as good credentials as the one that was giving you a problem here. And so you didn't. And you made sure that you didn't, and that made the union look bad, because the union wasn't able to get higher wages. And so the union began to be a burden in people's eyes. I don't like paying my dues to a union. It doesn't do. Nothing's happening to us. So screw the union. People weren't that interested in unions to begin with in America for lots of complicated reasons. So it didn't take all that much to push them away. So the unions began to look bad, and they got weaker. And that, of course, made the employer even freer not to give higher. It fed on itself, as I said. Yeah.
The actual juncture when that change took place,
yes,
when the wages no longer increased,
right,
was that the crisis? Was that 1973, or was that that the baby boomers were all of a sudden working age, or was it just a conjunction of all those?
All those things. All those things. Really. And don't look for a particular year. It's across the 70s. Some people like to say it's in the early part when the crisis hit. Usually the big crisis year of the 70s is considered to be 1974. And when the crisis here in New York went almost bankrupt if you go back and you read the stories. Other people say, no, it really happens a little later in 77. It doesn't really matter. It's in that period that this happens. Huh?
The outsourcing
Also begins then, and so some people like to point to that. And remember also, all the statistics in economics, all of them, are fuzzy. They have a lovely precision when you open a book like the government record, and there is a lovely table that gives you all these nice numbers right to the fourth decimal place. But these are not, don't get fetishized here. These numbers are collected by people who ask questions out in the field and who write down the answers, and then they collate them, and then somebody manipulates those numbers and someone else extrapolates them, and then it appears in the table. In the table it's nice and crisp and precise. The origins are very fuzzy. There's lots of debates. If you're ever interested, there's something that the United States Labor Department issues a journal called the Monthly Labor Review. And in it, you will see almost every other issue, if you go, and it's free on the internet, you'll see debates by economists and statisticians. What does the employment number really represent? We shouldn't say it represents this, because if you look at how the data are collected and who collects them and when they're collected, it skews it this way or that. And then they argue with each other. This one says we should collect them this way. And if you collect them this way, the unemployment rate really is X. Whereas if you collect it this way, the unemployment rate is really Y. What's the right unemployment rate? The answer is there is no right one. Depends on what you think you ought to be counting, how you think you ought to be counting, how you think you ought to be mathematically processing the information you gather. And those are always debates. And people change. One of the reasons it's very hard to get a long-term view of wages is that what wages were understood to be and how the information was gathered changes. Sometimes it changes because a new idea of how to count comes up. Sometimes it changes because politicians want to fudge the numbers because they don't want unemployment to be growing when they're running for office. They'd like it to be shrinking, and so they work out a reamendment. There were a lot of accusations of the Bush administration that it was doing that. I don't know whether they're true or not. Those are accusations that are often made. I'm sure they were made by the Republicans vis-a-vis Clinton before, and so on. But some of that goes on, and you'd have to do an awful lot of work, which I haven't done, and neither have the reporters who give you the numbers, as to what in order to come to some kind of consensus about it. And as I say, the experts are continuously arguing. If you go to the annual meetings of the American Association of Statisticians, you'll see that many of the panels at their annual meetings are debates over what statistics are being published, what their relationship is with their purported underlying realities, blah, blah, blah. So just always keep a kind of looseness in your own thinking about what you do with these numbers. If you have an argument that depends ruthlessly on a number, you're on very thin ice, very dangerous. You're going to find people shooting at you left and right about your argument who are quarreling with your data. I mean, you can always do that, and people always do. And there's always something to it. I'm not saying don't use it. I mean, obviously, I'm using some numbers here, but I'm stressing they're very rough, and that's all. I don't want to make claims that depend on a precision that isn't there. Okay? All right. So the first thing is profits went crazy. And I want to stress with you that the profits that went crazy everywhere. Please, again, this is not a depiction of profits that happened in the finance industry or in banks, or it happened everywhere. Wherever there's an employer and employees, this phenomena, more or less, it varies, of course, with each industry and each enterprise. But in general, this was a process that all employers took advantage of as much as they could, and that all employees lived with as much and as best as they could. So it is not fair to refer to this, as you'll see, as a financial crisis, since, as I'm going to show you, and as you've already seen, it's this phenomena that lies at the foundation of the crisis we're in. That's what we just went through. Workers who had to live through this experience, all workers across the economy, had to struggle with what we've seen, with changing family, with the pressures on the women, with the pressures on their budgets, with the pressure of their debts, etc., across the board. So this is a phenomenon that affected all workers across the economy, and this profit is something that was enjoyed by all employers, more or less, for a 30-year period. Okay, now let's follow the ball. Let's see what it means if employers have profits like that. What happens? First thing, money starts to accumulate in the accounts at the bank of corporations. Their profit account, the money in the bank that they don't need immediately to pay out in wages or to pay out in buying supplies, the profits, the discretionary fund that the board of directors is going to decide what to do with, this is becoming nice and big, and it's sitting in a bank. So right away, the banks are noticing that the thing that's really dramatic, the growth in the accounts, are the accounts of corporate profits, a kind of discretionary fund where often the corporation seeks the advice of the banker as to how profitably to invest it, since that's in a sense what they do with it. Second, we begin to see, starting in these 1970s, and particularly in the 80s and 90s, an explosion, historically unprecedented, of payment of huge new salary increases to top managers. There's an immense amount of literature about this. I'm sure you've all seen it. You read about it. You hear about it. Various people morally defend it. Others variously morally denounce it, etc., etc., etc. But the interesting thing, all I want you to see is it takes off then. We begin to get these CEO corporate packages that blow your mind, millions of dollars a year, either in direct salary payment or stock options or incentive programs and so forth and so on, kind of going out of all proportion. And if you look at the numbers, the most famous one that's used around the world is the numerical relationship between what a CEO gets and the average salary of a non-supervisory worker in an enterprise. So instead of going, I don't know what the numbers are, it's not in my head, but in the 1970s, let's say, the average ratio between what the CEO gets and the average of a non-supervisory worker might have been in the realm of 10 to 1, something like that. And then by 2000, it's in the realm of 200 to 1, something like that. Really off the chart, just to show you a sign of the gap. And we get a whole culture, I don't have the time to do it, a whole culture that celebrates this. Kind of euphoria set in. And the reason I stress it to you is that's very typical of capitalist cycles. When things are going well, there's a kind of hyping that gets revved up. It's almost like going, to a football game, and if your side is really getting all the touchdowns, you can kind of get carried away with the wonderfulness. That's why it's so shocking when your quarterback keels over or whatever it is that happens that's not so good, because you really weren't expecting bad news. And we got into that kind of place because people were making money, jobs were being created. It was such a dynamic sector of the American economy. Okay. In all this business in the financial sector, money was being made hand over fist by the finances, the bankers, insurance companies, stockbrokers. They were really the action. They were the excitement. Culturally, they were the center of it. They were making fantastic money, and they were accumulating huge profits in the banks. That was as a result of the huge profits created here in the production sector. So the profitability of the financial sector was derivative, but it was growing even faster than the rest of the economy for all the reasons I just went through. So the ingenuity, if you like, of a capitalist mentality came to be focused on finance. It was where the profits were, the salaries were the highest, the glitz was the greatest. So you began to have an explosion of innovation in finance. That is, the banks were so flush with young people, fresh out of business school or college, eager to become billionaires overnight, and willing to work crazy hours, which they typically were required to do. I really mean that. 60, 70, 80 hours a week. The rule among them was, whatever the supervisor asks you to do, if it means on Saturday, You come in. You have no life for 8 years, but boy, will you be rich when that 8 years is over, and you'll be able to do to others what was done to you, and they did. But I want to stress with you the two big innovations that this whole syndrome was able to produce in the financial sector. Very, very important to this crisis. First, the banks used their profit to look for new sources of money. They thought of themselves as profit-making engines, working at great speed with great results. So all they needed was more money coming in that they could turn into profitable uses. And the other thing they looked for was profitable uses. So we're a money-making machine. We just need to get more money to work with and find more outlets for investment, and there's no end to what will be. Where could you get more money coming in? The two things. Once they were going as a very profitable, expansionary, number one sector of growth in America, and they attracted to themselves all the attention and all the ingenuity and all the best capability of young people looking to be rich, then they had, in a sense, everything in place to have a profit explosion. And so what they concentrated on was, how can we get more money into our hands so that we can profitably use it? Look how profitable we're using the money that we've been getting, but we need more. We can handle more money. We want to handle more money because then we can make more money with the money. And there's no limit, and we're the best at it. So we have to find new sources of money. And the second thing we have to look is to find new outlets of profitable use of the money that we're going to be getting. That's what we're good at, and we have to go do our good work. And we're having a little bit of problem. We're having a problem on the revenue side because we already got all the money that the big corporations are getting, these rising profits. We got that. And we're not going to get any more from the American people because they don't have any. They're tapped out. So there's no growth there. So we got to find new resources of money to flow into our hands. And we have to be able to find new profit outlets. Now, some of them I've already talked to you about, IPOs and all this kind of wheeling and dealing among corporations. They were already into that. But they were looking for new profitable ventures beyond that because they were confident that they'd find new resources. They were confident in their own ability, so they had to find new outlets. And what I want to tell you about is the new resources they found and the new outlets they found. First, the new resources. The new resources they found, the most important one is the rest of the world. This is a 30-year period in which American banks really become multinational. They were already before. They didn't start then. Citibank has a long history, for example, in Latin America or in Asia. But now you have the expansion of those American banks that had foreign offices, quadruple them. Many banks that had no foreign offices established one, and then 5, and then 9. The numbers are really amazing. The number of American banks with offices in Hong Kong goes through the roof. The number of American banks opening in China, in the People's Republic of China, not in Hong Kong, but in China proper, explodes. And everywhere else, too. Every third world country gets American banks, lots of them. They set up in Nigeria or in Buenos Aires or all over. What's this about? Basically, one of its major driving forces, not the only one, but one of the major driving forces, to get local people to deposit savings and money in an American branch bank. The advertising, if you follow those banks, was very clear. It is safer for you. It is better for you. It is more profitable for you to be connected into the world economy through Citibank here in no place, Paraguay, than to be in the local Paraguayan, whatever it is, bank. A direct assault in this way, offering not only the supposed greater security, better connectedness, greater savvy in finance, but also offering better returns. It's very hard for a third world person to put his or her money in a less secure bank doing less well than what is perceived to be a more secure bank that offers a higher rate of return. That's not too hard. That's very difficult. And banks began to get their hands on the savings of the rest of the world, which they had not done before. That was a very important new resource. They were even able, with some deft diplomacy, which is a fancy term for bribery, they were able to get third world governments and even some second world or first world governments to deposit money in the local branch of the Citibank too, for all kinds of reasons. Of course, there was the old standing reason why an American bank goes abroad, and that is because its customers are multinational corporations, and you need to be located where your customer is doing business. Otherwise, your customer located in that country will have to do business with a local bank, and that may mature into an ongoing relationship with that other bank rather than you. So you needed to forestall that. So there were other reasons why banks went abroad. But one thing they began to notice was that the rest of the world had savings. By the 1980s, the American working class was so exhausted and so tapped out, it didn't save any more money. It's been famous now for 20 years, Americans don't save. But the rest of the world does. The mass of people in the rest of the world saves money. And the question is, where do they put it? Who gets to play with it while they save it? And the American banks decided they want to get in on that. That is very, very lucrative business. The other thing they learned is, it's a smaller phenomena, but it's becoming larger and larger, although it's a little faded now for obvious reasons. It turns out that America at that time, remember, one of the reasons the wages didn't go up was we had a big flow of immigrants. Okay, immigrants send money home. Question, who handles that transaction, which is very profitable, and into what depositing institution in the home country does the return flow from Mary or John who are working in Chicago? Where does it go? And the American banks began to see they don't want to lose the customer, the Chicago immigrant, when he or she sends money back to Poland or Paraguay or Nigeria or wherever. And so it became necessary to handle the transaction. If any of you will have friends who are immigrants who do this, you'll know that the fees that are paid by immigrants to send money home is, to use a technical term, robbery. It's extortionate high rates of fee. Citibank a few years ago bought a Mexican bank called Banamex. Banamex, the biggest bank in Mexico. The reason? To get its hands on the remittance fees of all those Mexicans in the United States that sent money home. Yeah.
The interesting part is that even if you have the same bank in your country, the
fees,
will be the same.
Yeah, very high fee. Long ago, the banks all understood they had an absolutely captive audience, it's called. These immigrants have to send that money back. Their families depend on it. They can't. There's nothing else they can do. So, you got them.
Starting to change though.
Yes.
With ATMs and what.
It's starting to change now. It's also beginning to really change because the business is drying up. Mexicans in huge numbers are leaving the United States to go home, and those that are here are sending smaller remittances, partly because many of them are unemployed or losing their income. So the whole business is in trouble, and of course the results for Mexico are beyond words. I said it to you I think once before, I'll say it to you again. One of the societies most close to the edge of blowing up and becoming a headline for us in this country in the next few months is Mexico. The economic conditions of our southern neighbor are, you read now, you pay attention, you will notice little stories about, a war between a gang of drug dealers, generic term for everybody, who's shooting at the police. I can assure you, there are a lot of people who shoot at the police for all the usual reasons. People don't like the police. And that's true in Mexico either. This designating everybody as a drug dealer is basically doing the public relations work of the police department. so that neither the Mexican population nor the Americans are going to confront what it means when you have pitched battles in half the cities of your country, which is what normally exists now in Mexico. The idea that this is all about drugs is childish. It's not the case. It's a society that's falling apart. They exported millions of people to the United States because there was no work in Mexico for them. And there was work here. Those people who would have been an explosive unemployment problem inside Mexico were exported out of Mexico. Not only did that remove the problem of people for whom there was no work, it solved a lot of Mexico's problem because all those people sent money back in. They left and they returned the money. For Mexico, perfect. Now we have perfect in reverse. The people for whom there are no jobs are coming back, and the money that they counted on is drying up. Oh, very bad. And nothing is solving their problem. They have nothing else to sell. They have nothing else with which to cope with this problem, so they are disintegrating as an economic system. Extraordinary side issue of this crisis, but that may become front page issue any day now. Okay. In this total story then, not only is there explosive profits and high wages, but everybody who can get in on this expansive sector is having a wonderful time, earning a lot of money, working very hard, but earning a lot of money. These people are concentrated in a few places, like here, Lower Manhattan. They create a whole new industry, the conversion of dirty old warehouse buildings into new loft apartments at huge rates in the financial district, in Tribeca, places that you wouldn't want to go to late in an afternoon, let alone the evening, a few years ago. They become the chicest, bestest, most expensive, super-duper locations for new tapas restaurants, etc., etc. Okay? Well, that's a big industry that's created. It also creates, of course, and this is a little footnote for all of you, a dependence of certain cities, like New York, on all of this continuing. And when that stops, like now, oh my goodness, what is going to happen to a city like New York that is so dependent? If you ever want to look at the numbers, take a look at the percentage of the revenue of the city and state of New York that is derived from bonuses, not the regular salary, just the bonuses paid around Christmas time to financial sector workers every year, or used to be. And what it means to the revenue of Mr. Patterson as governor and Mr. Bloomberg as mayor, that those bonuses are not being handed out the way they were, and therefore the tax, which is very high on those bonuses, is not being collected. So another side issue. But last point about this before we change the focus a little bit. America as an economy became conscious, our society, that we were getting rid of the manufacturing, the kind of old style jobs, the factory jobs, the cities built around factories, the Clevelands, the Youngstown, Ohios, the Pittsburghs, all of that, just dying. If you visited them across the last 25 years, it's really sad. There's either nothing. Some of you know Michael Moore's film, what was the first one about Roger and Me, where you have the panoramas of Flint, Michigan, another one of these cities, of these sort of, overgrown with weeds, empty lots with abandoned factories in the background. It's worth taking a look just to see the kind of art photography that he has in there of these destroyed cities. Detroit, horrible. And those that are saved in a very peculiar fashion. No jobs, no industry. Instead, the downtown abandoned factory and office buildings are made into boutiques. And if you go to Pittsburgh, it's stunning. The whole city is a wasteland, but in the middle, modern hotels with underground passages linking one old factory that has been redone as a lovely collection of sort of mall of little boutiques that are all much too expensive for anybody in the city of Detroit or Pittsburgh to pay for, but are basically there for conventions to come in, be at the hotel, have their meetings, go to the 6 restaurants you can safely walk to, and then get on the airplane and get the hell out of there, because the minute you take a walk more than 2 blocks out of this little center, you get real depressed at what you see. And the main function of the police is to be like the old wagons, to circle this core center and keep the people from the rest of the city from coming in, and save them, the poor benighted drunks from inside, from wandering out and never coming back. Very, very sad. Town after town does this. By the way, the building of a mall inside a dead town is called urban renewal. But it is urban, the renewal part. There may be 6 of those things that worked in the United States for very special reasons, and most of them don't. Most of these urban malls have to be refinanced every 5 to 7 years. They're financial disasters. I lived for many years in New Haven, Connecticut. It's a perfect example. It's a city that constantly refinances its downtown mall, that is a dead mall, to which only poor people in the city go by bus. All the people with cars go only to suburban malls because they're afraid of the mall in downtown. And it's a disaster. It's a city that has no industry anymore. It lives off of this mall, the poor people who can't move out, who are the majority. And the city ranks as one of the 7th poorest in the United States. The U.S. Census Department ranks large cities by doing the following, if you're interested. It makes a fraction. In the numerator are the number of families that live below the official poverty line, and in the denominator are the total number of families in the town. So that you measure the poverty of a city by the size of the proportion of its families that are below the poverty line. By that standard, for all large cities, that's cities with a population over 100,000, that's the way the Census Bureau does it, New Haven ranks number 7, 7th poorest city. Connecticut, which is the richest state in the Union by per capita income, is the only state that has 2 of the top 10 poorest cities in it. Hartford, which is the capital, and New Haven, the 2 biggest cities. So think of it. Connecticut has the richest, living cheek by jowl with the poorest. Recipe for disaster. In New Haven, it's even starker, because the 7th poorest city in the United States subsidizes the delivery of free services to the 4th richest university on this planet. New Haven subsidizes Yale. In the local community, this is called, and it's said with great pride, we are Robin Hood in reverse. Here we steal from the poor and give it to the rich. Not a sustainable arrangement. New Haven will also one day blow up from this contradiction. All of this comes to a head in this society as the wealth gets more and more concentrated. All statistics across these 30-year periods document the growing inequality of wealth and income in the United States. In the 1970s, the United States was markedly less, had a lower inequality of income and wealth distribution than most of the countries of Western Europe. That is, we were more equal as a society in terms of wealth and income than, say, France or Germany or Italy. I don't remember each country, but in general. 30 years later, reverse. We are the most unequal compared to those societies. I mean, a dramatic change in the ranking in a relatively short number of years. But that's because of this explosion of profit that concentrates the profit in a very small sector. But it's the sector that's most well connected. And if I had time, I would talk to you about what such a concentration of wealth in such a small sector permits these people to do in shaping the politics. In a society where money is what enables a political candidate to bring his or her message to the people, to the expensive medium of TV and so forth, your ability to raise money, if those of you who follow American politics, you know that early in the primaries, the newspapers now discuss this and that person running to win the primary in terms of how much money he or she has been able to raise, because we all understand that will determine how much of a machine they can buy, how much advertising they can afford, etc., etc. So in a concentration of wealth, in a society whose politics is money dependent, ... you all know the result. The mayor of New York is not a poor person. Right? Why? There's something to do. It has some relationship, I'm sure you've all figured out, between the wealth he has and the position he occupies. It doesn't say that a person without wealth can't get there, but there is a growing phenomena of people with independent wealth being able to do this. So in the United States, production moves away from manufacturing. This process had been going on a long time, speeds up in the last 30 years. We become more and more an economy focused on moving paper around, finance, real estate, trading title to things, arranging deals. But we don't make much stuff. As I already told you before, with a squeezed working class, squeezed for all the reasons we've gone through, it becomes necessary for American producers of goods for a working class that's squeezed to be able to produce them more cheaply. And American companies have already been shown how to do that. And the answer is, get the hell out of the United States. Go to where the labor is cheap. Go to where the rules against polluting are non-existent or easily waivable. Go to China. Go to Asia. Go to Latin America. Go out. Produce it there and bring it back into the United States. Use all your distribution systems. Use your well-known, recognized name, but don't make it here. So the very processes that I'm talking about build on themselves. More and more production is out of the United States, and more finance and all that is concentrated here. It produces this process in the United States, a very peculiar world economy.